Deep within the shadows of our tank barn lies a dangerous predator. From the onset, it was an endangered species, but it still had the tools to survive. It could hunt effectively in any weather and had evolved for difficult terrain. It was maneuverable as opposed to its predecessor, and low to the ground, allowing it to stalk its prey. And yet, on the battlefield, our soldiers chose to paint it yellow.
It's the fall of 1945, and the Pershing must be updated. Truly, its problem was the underpowered GAF V8 engine. The solution, however, appeared to be provided by Continental. Their AV series air-cooled 12-cylinder engines would give the Pershing the power it needed to traverse rough terrain. Now, the Pershing is first upgraded to the M26 E2, basically the M26 with the first version of the AV engine. The E2 also featured a cross-drive transmission, and this transmission, the CD850 series, combined the functions of a transmission, steering control, and brakes all into one. This meant no more handbrake steering, and the ability to pivot in one place, although for the sake of the tracks, we're not going to try that on this very old vehicle. Upgrades in both the engine series and the transmission during testing would later turn the Pershing into its own vehicle, the T40 medium tank. By 1948, 10 T40s had been built at Aberdeen, adding all the physical features we see today on this vehicle. Therefore, the T40 was quickly standardized as the M46 Patton medium tank in July of 1948.
Being that the M46 is derived from the M26, it can sometimes be difficult to tell the two apart. But that being said, if you know where to look, both internal and external differences really do make these two vehicles distinct. The most obvious difference between the M46 and the M26 is the Patton's much larger engine. This 12-cylinder Continental monster is able to generate almost 810 horsepower gross and about 704 horsepower net. That is a lot more than the Pershing's 500 gross and about 450 net. But that being said, this vehicle is now able to move at almost 5 miles per hour faster than the Pershing on the ground. That's 30 versus about 25, despite the fact that the Patton weighs almost 5,000 pounds more. But all that engine needs a lot of air to cool it, that air which is now being sucked up from underneath the vehicle and passing out through the other big difference between the Pershing and the Patton, this large amount of armor grills that you see beneath my feet here. Again, that keeps the engine nice and cool, but then the engine exhaust pipes are also different. We can see here that on the Patton, they're mounted underneath these plates up here on the fender, which again is another big cosmetic difference from that of the Pershing. Keeping with that theme of cosmetic difference, one of the biggest changes to the Patton is actually its smallest, this little track tension idler which we have here at the rear of the vehicle. It does exactly what you think it would. It keeps the tracks under tension, which allows them to not be thrown as the vehicle performs difficult maneuvers. But if you look down the track assembly here, eagle-eyed viewers might notice that we're missing a couple of return rollers up here at the top. Now, we should have 5, but in fact our Patton only has 3. That's not necessarily a mistake on our part, rather it was just how the vehicle was restored. When its original hull was discovered, somewhere in Poland I think, this vehicle only had these 3 wheels, and while it should have 5, it in fact still has the mounts for them, although they've since been welded over. Another change is the M46's new cannon. Now, it's not necessarily new, it's still a 90mm, but unlike the M26's M3 90mm cannon, this is the M3A1. And the big difference is that fume extractor down there at the end of the barrel. Now, that fume extractor pulls firing gases from the gun breech and pushes them out of the barrel. But beyond that difference, the 90mm here on the Patton lost none of that anti-tank punch that was so famous with the Pershing or even other tank destroyers before it. Just like its stop and start development history, the M46's only wartime service was just as chaotic, although it wasn't entirely the tank's fault. You see, back in 1948, there were only supposed to be 800 Pattons built for the Army, with a further 1,200 or so converted from existing Pershings. But this plan was stopped abruptly by events which occurred in Korea.
Korea started rough. The first 40 days were a battle for time. There were too many North Koreans with too much heavy equipment, especially tanks. What can men with guts do against tanks?
The need for tanks was sudden and caught the United States military entirely off guard. While M46s were being produced, the converting of Pershings wasn't really working out. Of course, many weren't up to modern standards. And the Pershings already in the field, well, they were being rushed to Korea anyway, with no time to perform conversions. The Army couldn't even build new M46s. Many of its features had already been claimed obsolete. But the immediacy of war meant that a brand new tank couldn't be fully developed either, forcing, of course, this vehicle to now serve as the dreaded stopgap measure. It should be mentioned, however, that at the same time, an emergency program was already being developed. This was to combine the proven chassis of the M46 with the turret of the experimental T-42 medium tank, and that, of course, would later create what we call the M47 Patton. Americans weren't very good at making new tank names. All this rapid scrambling to get the M46, or any tank for that matter, into Korea naturally renewed interest into working out the failings of the original M46 in testing, and overall the M46A1 Patton being introduced starting in 1951, roughly at the beginning of the Korean War. Now, Pattons with the 6th Tank Battalion actually arrived in country, that is Korea, on the 8th of August in 1950, mainly to shore up the defenses around the Pusan perimeter.
With the arrival of tank units in Korea, things became more balanced. U.S. tanks, as part of the UN force, swung into action quickly. The establishment of the Pusan perimeter permitted us to build up an offensive force. This was largely due to tank support. During this holding action, maximum advantage was made of long-range direct tank fire and small, hard-hitting tank elements to maintain the lines.
The Patton was preferred for its better maneuverability over the Pershing before it. It simply had a better power-to-weight ratio. But broadly in Korea, it was still the old M4 Sherman that actually ended up leading the offensive into the mountainous terrain of the north. While it could easily be argued that the armor and firepower of the M46 was superior to that of the M4A3 76mm Sherman, the M46, due to its nature as a stopgap, never fully replaced the old M4. Of course, the Korean War would dramatically change with the later intervention of the Chinese army, who during the second phase offensive in 1950 would force America back, so fast in fact that many M46s were abandoned in North Korea during the retreat, and some even got left on their flat cars, still being shipped to Pyongyang. This retreat would prove to be the longest in United States military history. But despite abandoning North Korea, the UN forces decided to make a stand at Chipyong-ni back in South Korea. That battle, called the Gettysburg of the Korean War, saw United Nations forces and US forces as well completely surrounded and besieged by the Chinese. In the end, a relief force called Task Force Crombez would break through to assist them, a task that was easier said than done, bringing along some M46s placed at the head of the armored column to protect lesser armored M4 Shermans behind. Armor was the only thing, after all, that could break through the massed Chinese infantry. Although again, that mission was easier said than done. The infantry not only would surround the tanks as they made their way through thin mountain passes, but to make matters worse, they were also equipped with RPGs. To make the advance go a little bit easier, infantry initially rode on the Pattons. But Task Force Crombez, starting with 160 men riding on the tanks, would only end up with 23 by the end of their breakthrough, and half of them would be wounded. But during the breakthrough, the M46s were favored for their ability to pivot in place to, of course, turn around in mountain passes, and at the same time they had thicker armor, again, than the M4 Shermans that were also used in the line. Overall, the M46 would stay in Korea even past the end of the 1953 armistice. It would actually stay there until February of 1957, when it was finally declared obsolete. But no new vehicles were allowed in Korea for the next 5 years, hence the M46 remaining alongside, in fact, the Sherman. The M4A376 was listed obsolete at the same time as the 46 was, ending the M4's venerable 15-year career. The Sherman was indeed still around. Odd as it sounds, by the end of the Korean War, the M4A3 was still the most utilized American tank in country. While medium tanks like the M26 and the M46 had strove to replace the Sherman, the 76mm cannon on it was nothing to laugh at. It had held its own against North Korean T-34s early in the war, and it served as infantry support in many areas these larger medium tanks, like the one behind me, couldn't get to, like tiny mountain roads. But in any case, by the end of the war, the lack of tanks in the Chinese army saw the fighting mostly dominated by infantry and artillery anyway. So really most tanks that served during Korea didn't see proper use. It's dark inside the interior of the M46A1 Patton, just like it was in the winter of 1951 on the 38th parallel. So that's why I'm going to hit the master switch so we can use the interior lighting to see the inside of this vehicle. What you're seeing right now are the original interior lights in our M46A1 Patton. But you notice that currently the lights are flipped over to red. These are our low lighting interior lights. They not only preserve the crew's eyesight in nighttime conditions, they also keep light from emanating out the hatches of this vehicle. And we can see that at least the opposite version of it here inside the tank. Just behind me, the light from the shop room outside is already coming in through the cracks in the hatches. If you can imagine fighting at night with light coming out of these hatches, the enemy could see the tank. That's why you actually have to disable a safety on these lights first before you turn them over to the white side. So let's talk about the control panel. The biggest difference between the M46's control panel and the M46A1's control panel, we're of course seated in A1, is this difference here, the combined tachometer and speedometer sitting here right on the side of the panel itself. Now, if I want to start the vehicle, especially if I'm starting from a cold start, meaning that the engine hasn't ran in a while, the first thing I'm going to want to do is put a little bit of fuel in the engine using this manual fuel pump here. Although you might want to use it even if the vehicle has been running, as you just always want a little bit of fuel in that engine to begin with. Then I simply switch on my magnetos here with these switches, and then I'm going to pull on my booster switch, which is then going to allow me to pull on the starter and start the vehicle. Now, once the vehicle is actually running, the way that I move the vehicle around is a lot simpler than what we might have seen in something like an M4 Sherman or an M26 Pershing. Gone are those old handbrakes here for stopping one side of the vehicle, allowing it to turn left or right, and all of the steering and even the actual gearing, that is the low and high gears, the reverse gear, it's all been put into this simple joystick here, what's sometimes just called the wobble stick. So to move the vehicle, I just put it in gear. This is in the low gear here, and then I move the wobble stick just a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. So if you've played a game of Galaga or if you've played Pac-Man, you can probably drive an M46 Patton. Now, when the vehicle is driving and I want it to speed up, I can use a simple foot throttle right down here at my feet. And when the vehicle is actually stopped, but I want to keep the engine running, that is speeding up its RPMs, I can easily use a hand throttle to do the exact same thing. And that can keep the vehicle at a steady RPM so the engine doesn't become flooded with fuel. So to stop the vehicle, I just hit the simple foot brake in front of me, and if I really want to get the vehicle to not move at all once it's fully shut down, I can use that foot brake to engage the parking brake, which is right here next to me, as it's engaged now. But to actually turn the vehicle off, as per the tech manual for the M46 and the M46A1, I first am going to use that hand throttle to throttle the vehicle up to 1,000 RPM, and it will remain there for 5 minutes, letting fuel slowly get processed through the engine, and then eventually I'll empty the engine of fuel, or at least as best I can, with the degasser switch, which is right here. Now this is an interesting difference here on our M46A1's control panel. The degasser switch on a normal A1 control panel should actually be right here between these two gauges, but it's underneath our booster and starter switch. That is actually indicative of an M47 Patton. And we know that at the very least, the first part of this control panel is from an M47, something that is probably a quirk of post-war restoration. But that's not the only thing that's a little bit quirky on the interior of this vehicle. It's missing its other wobble stick, which is right actually here in front of the camera, at least the space for it, which would allow the assistant driver here to actually pilot the vehicle. He not only would have a whole secondary wobble stick, he'd also have a secondary foot throttle, hand throttle, and even foot brake. And while this vehicle retains the foot throttle and the foot brake, it is missing the hand throttle and again missing that wobble stick, something that I can only assume is due to its post-war service or partial restoration. But what else do we have here on the interior of our M46? We have a whole bunch of other interesting bits and bobs, and just a few that I'll mention offhandedly. First of which is actually right at my feet. It's a new type of escape hatch. Unlike what we would see in an M4 Sherman, for example, the escape hatch here is actually in front of the seat and not underneath it, making it easier to pull on and have it drop out the bottom of the vehicle, making for an easier egress, to be sure. But then our M46 also still has its original horn, so this tiger still does roar. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention the one thing that's probably on your mind right now. And yes, it does have origins in Korea. Why the heck is this thing painted like a tiger? Now, you're probably expecting me to say something along the lines of the United Nations forces, America chiefly, believed that the superstitious Chinese would be terrified by the visage of a tiger painted on a tank. But for just a second, let's think about that logically. First off, the tiger paint scheme had already been seen before, back in World War II, and in China nonetheless, with Chinese and United States provisional troops. But later, here in Korea, this is point number 2, when the Tiger paint becomes popular, this is about winter of 1950 and early 1951, America had already been retreating for over a month at the hands of the Chinese. And I assure you that during that massive retreat, many Chinese had already destroyed tanks. Even assuming that everyone in the Chinese army were complete Luddites, which they weren't, the Chinese at this point would have at least known the difference between a green tank and a yellow one. And finally, the scheme mostly appears before Operation Ripper. This is March of 1951, the United Nations and United States counteroffensive. I've heard some say that the scheme was due to the Chinese Year of the Tiger, which, by the way, ended in February of 1951. So now we're taking place a month later. Consequently, this, of course, was the Year of the Rabbit, but it was obviously cooler to stick with the Tiger paint scheme. Yet despite these points, someone in the Army clearly got it in their heads that it might psychologically affect the Chinese. The Army even advertised this fact in Combat Bulletin number 108, made in 1951.
During the period 5 to 12 March, the United Nations attrition offensive moved steadily ahead in the Yangpyeong area north of the Han River. The 8th Army's numerically superior armor enables them to supply Allied foot soldiers with maximum support. These tanks, playing on the superstitious nature of the enemy, are painted with the markings of the Tiger. Intensified armor-supported attacks of this kind are rolling back the Red aggressors along most of the front and are preventing them from initiating any offensive action of their own.
But that's just propaganda. There are no official documents that suggest this strategy was effective in any case, and nothing that officially suggests that the soldiers themselves thought it would be a good idea. So why do it in the first place? Well, we have to imagine that this was inspired to kind of create a morale boost and also an additional bit of camaraderie amongst tank crews in the face of those Chinese defeats. We can see how paint schemes in previous wars already were used for camaraderie like this, like the Flying Tigers, also serving in China during World War II, painting those shark mouths on the front of their aircraft. Now, morale was probably the reason why Colonel Crombez himself had tankers from 5th Cavalry paint their vehicles while a part of his task force. And other units who did the Tiger scheme sometimes didn't even paint Tigers, making them even more personal, like the Red Devils of the 89th Tank Battalion, Company C, who just painted the front plates of their Shermans usually red with a scary face. We can only imagine then that coming off of American defeats in the hands of the Chinese, anything which would give the soldiers something to take their minds off the impending counteroffensive would have been accepted with open arms. After all, as a soldier, you aren't going to have many chances to personalize your tank this dramatically in combat. Hence the reason why we see this scheme adopted in so many unique ways. And at the end of the day, a tank was still scary to an infantryman, yellow or otherwise. For most people to summarize the M46 Patton, I think they would just say it's a Pershing with a bigger engine. And while that's not necessarily untrue, it's perhaps a little bit unfair. This vehicle, at least in Korea, had the best combat characteristics of any American tank there. It had the largest cannon, it had the biggest engine, it had the thickest armor, but it was built on the hull of that lackluster Pershing, which doomed it to the category of stopgap for the remainder of its career. And it was already obsolete when it arrived here in Korea in the first place, never being able to come into its own in a war that was full of twists and turns that the Patton, despite its maneuverability advantages, couldn't necessarily navigate. So this vehicle unfortunately never had the chance to really live up to the fame and fortune of its namesake. But that being said, it's not the only Patton, is it? Oh yes, we do have more of them, but we'll talk about them later. Thanks for watching.